Classical Chinese medicine does not begin with anatomy, organs, or substances, but with careful observation of how patterns emerge over time in living systems, including the human body, the natural environment, and the rhythms that connect them. This observation was not experimental in the modern scientific sense, nor was it focused on isolating variables or identifying fixed structures, but instead emphasized sustained attention to change, continuity, and response across different conditions. From its earliest development, classical Chinese medicine was far less concerned with what the body was made of, and far more concerned with what the body did, how it responded to internal and external influences, and how it maintained coherence while circumstances were constantly shifting. This distinction is essential to understand, because many modern misunderstandings of Chinese medicine arise from the assumption that it was attempting to describe the body in the same way contemporary biology does, an assumption that does not hold when examined historically or conceptually. Classical Chinese medicine developed long before dissection, microscopy, or chemical analysis were available. Yet rather than being limited by this absence, it cultivated a different mode of understanding that focused on relationship, function, and observable change. Within this framework, the body was not treated as a fixed object that occasionally malfunctioned, but as a dynamic process that was always adjusting, reorganizing, and negotiating balance in response to its environment. Health, therefore, was not defined as perfection, stillness, or the absence of change, but as coherence, meaning the system's capacity to respond appropriately to shifting conditions without losing its internal order. This way of thinking shaped every aspect of classical Chinese medicine, influencing how patterns were recognized, how imbalance was described, and why multiple explanatory models were used instead of a single definitive account of bodily function. Rather than attempting to reduce complexity into one controlling mechanism or primary structure, classical Chinese medicine accepted that different perspectives were necessary to understand different aspects of the same living system. Before engaging with specific concepts, systems, or terminology, it is important to recognize that classical Chinese medicine was never intended to function as a catalog of anatomical parts or material components. It was developed as a language for describing relationship, movement, and change, allowing practitioners to track how processes unfolded over time, rather than fixing meaning to static forms. In classical Chinese medicine, the body is not understood as something static or fixed, but as something that is always in motion, always adjusting, and always responding to changing conditions. Movement, transformation, and regulation were not considered special events that occurred only during illness or stress, but the normal and ongoing activity of a healthy living system. Breathing changes from moment to moment. Digestion rises and falls throughout the day. Temperature shifts in response to environment, and emotional states subtly influence physical function, all without conscious effort. Rather than separating these processes into isolated systems, classical Chinese medicine treated them as interdependent aspects of a single continuous flow of activity within the body. Because of this perspective, stability was never defined as stillness or uniformity, but as the ability to adapt smoothly to change without losing internal coordination. A body that could adjust its rhythms, redistribute its resources, and respond proportionally to challenge was considered stable, even though it was never the same from one moment to the next. This understanding led classical physicians to focus less on fixed measurements and more on tendencies, transitions, and the direction in which a process was moving over time. The body was not compared to a machine with interchangeable parts, but to natural systems such as weather patterns, flowing water, or the changing landscape across seasons. These comparisons were not symbolic or poetic in intent, but practical tools for understanding how complex systems behave when they are alive, responsive, and self-regulating. To understand the body in this framework, it was necessary to observe not only what was present, but how quickly changes occurred, how smoothly transitions unfolded, and whether responses were appropriate to circumstance. When imbalance appeared, it was rarely understood as the sudden failure of a part, but as a gradual loss of coordination within ongoing processes that had once functioned smoothly. For this reason, classical Chinese medicine emphasized early signs, subtle shifts, and changes in rhythm long before overt breakdown or disease became visible. Understanding the body as a process rather than an object allowed this medical system to remain flexible, context-sensitive, and responsive to individual variation. It also made clear that health could never be separated from time, environment, or circumstance, because the body itself was inseparable from the conditions in which it was constantly unfolding. Because the body was understood as a living process, classical Chinese medicine placed greater importance on relationships than on individual structures or isolated components. No function was understood to exist on its own, and no part of the body was believed to act independently from the rest of the system. Physiological activity gained meaning only through relationship, meaning how one process influenced another, how balance was maintained between opposing tendencies, and how coordination was preserved across the whole. Qualities such as warmth and cooling, movement and stillness, or activity and rest were never judged as beneficial or harmful by themselves, but only in relation to timing, proportion, and context. A quality that supported health in one situation could indicate imbalance in another, not because the quality itself had changed, but because its relationship to the rest of the system had shifted. This relational way of thinking explains why classical Chinese medicine never sought a single controlling center within the body, such as a master organ or primary regulatory structure. Instead, the body was understood as a network of interacting processes, each influencing and being influenced by the others in a continual process of adjustment. When imbalance appeared, the question was rarely framed as which part had failed, but rather how coordination between processes had been lost or distorted over time. This perspective allowed practitioners to investigate how changes in one area could produce effects elsewhere, even when no obvious structural connection was visible. Because relationships were central, multiple explanatory frameworks could coexist without contradiction, each highlighting a different set of interactions within the same body. No single framework was expected to explain everything, and no single description was treated as complete or final. This flexibility allowed classical Chinese medicine to respond to complexity without reducing it, and to adjust understanding as conditions evolved. By prioritizing relationship over structure, the system remained capable of describing living bodies as they actually behave, rather than forcing them into fixed or simplified models. Because relationships were central to understanding the body, classical Chinese medicine relied on patterns rather than isolated signs as its primary source of information. A pattern was not understood as a fixed condition or a named disease, but as a recognizable configuration of tendencies that appeared through observation over time. Individual signs such as temperature, sensation, movement, or emotional tone were never interpreted on their own, but were considered meaningful only in relation to other signs and the context in which they appeared. Classical physicians were trained to notice how signs clustered together, how they changed with circumstance, and how they responded to shifts in environment, activity, or internal state. Because of this, single observations were rarely considered sufficient, and conclusions were drawn only after repeated observation across time and conditions. Pattern recognition required patience, attention, and sensitivity to nuance, rather than reliance on fixed thresholds or isolated measurements. This approach explains why classical Chinese medicine did not aim to identify diseases as static entities, but instead sought to describe the dynamic state of imbalance as it was unfolding in the present moment. Patterns were understood to be provisional by nature, meaning they could shift as the body responded, adapted, or moved toward greater coherence. For this reason, diagnosis was never considered a final label, but an ongoing process of interpretation that evolved alongside the patient's condition. A pattern, in this sense, functioned as a living description rather than a permanent classification, guiding understanding without fixing meaning. By prioritizing patterns over isolated signs, classical Chinese medicine maintained flexibility and responsiveness while still allowing for clear and structured clinical reasoning. This emphasis on pattern recognition formed the foundation for all subsequent theory, guiding how imbalance was understood, communicated, and addressed. As classical Chinese medicine developed, it became increasingly focused on function rather than substance as the primary way of understanding the body. Many of the terms used in this system sound concrete when translated into modern language, but they were not intended to describe physical objects, tissues, or material substances. Instead, these terms described activity, behavior, and influence, meaning what something did, how it moved, and how it affected other processes within the body. This distinction is important because modern thinking often assumes that meaningful descriptions must refer to identifiable structures or measurable components. Classical Chinese medicine did not share this assumption and deliberately avoided reducing function into fixed material definitions. By keeping its language functional rather than structural, the system remained flexible enough to describe the same activity at different levels without contradiction. A single term could refer to a pattern of movement, a tendency toward change, or a way in which processes interacted, depending on context. This flexibility allowed classical physicians to track how function shifted over time, rather than forcing observations into rigid categories. Rather than asking what something was made of, practitioners asked how it behaved when balance was present, and how that behavior changed when balance was lost. This approach made it possible to work with subtle changes in function long before obvious structural damage or disease appeared. By emphasizing function over substance, classical Chinese medicine maintained a practical and adaptive framework that could respond to variation between individuals and environments. This functional orientation also explains why the system remained relevant across centuries, even as cultural and material conditions continued to change. Time plays a central role in how classical Chinese medicine understands the body because no process was ever evaluated outside of the moment in which it occurred. Physiological activity was always considered in relation to timing, including daily rhythms, seasonal changes, and the broader cycles that shape growth, decline, and renewal. A response that appeared appropriate at one time of day or one season of the year could indicate imbalance at another, not because the response itself was wrong, but because its timing was no longer suitable. For this reason, classical physicians paid close attention to when signs appeared, how long they lasted, and how they shifted across different conditions. Symptoms were never interpreted as static events, but as expressions of ongoing processes unfolding through time. This emphasis on rhythm prevented rigid interpretation and encouraged practitioners to remain responsive rather than attached to fixed conclusions. The body was understood to follow natural cycles of activity and rest, expansion and contraction, warming and cooling, all of which required appropriate timing to remain coordinated. When these rhythms became disrupted, imbalance was more likely to appear, even if individual functions seemed intact when examined in isolation. Understanding the body therefore required sensitivity to context, including environment, lifestyle, and the circumstances surrounding a person's daily life. A change in setting, routine, or season could alter how the body responded, sometimes revealing imbalance that had previously remained hidden. By emphasizing time and rhythm, classical Chinese medicine reinforced the idea that health is situational rather than absolute. Balance was not something achieved once and maintained indefinitely, but something that had to be continuously negotiated as conditions evolved. This sensitivity to timing and context allowed the system to remain flexible, precise, and responsive to the living reality of the body. Because the body was understood as complex, dynamic, and constantly changing, classical Chinese medicine did not rely on a single explanatory model to describe how it functioned. No single framework was considered capable of capturing every relationship, rhythm, or process occurring within a living body at the same time. Instead, multiple models were developed, each offering a different way of observing, organizing, and understanding the same underlying reality. These models were not seen as competing theories, but as complementary perspectives, each highlighting certain relationships while leaving others in the background. Depending on the situation, one model might clarify what was happening more effectively than another, without invalidating the usefulness of the rest. This approach allowed practitioners to shift perspective when needed, rather than forcing all observations into a single rigid framework. When one model failed to explain a pattern clearly, another could be applied to reveal different connections or tendencies within the same body. This flexibility reduced the risk of oversimplification and helped preserve sensitivity to individual variation and changing conditions. Importantly, these models were never intended to describe separate bodies or separate systems, but different ways of viewing the same integrated whole. Each model emphasized relationship, movement, and balance, while approaching these principles from a slightly different angle. By accepting the need for multiple perspectives, classical Chinese medicine avoided the assumption that any single explanation could be complete or final. This openness allowed the system to remain adaptable, context-sensitive, and capable of responding to complexity without losing coherence. The use of multiple models reflects a broader commitment to understanding the body as it actually behaves, rather than forcing it to conform to a single theoretical lens. Classical Chinese medicine endured over centuries not because it resisted change, but because it was designed to accommodate change without losing its internal logic. Its concepts were never fixed to a single historical moment, technological limitation, or cultural condition, but were flexible enough to be reinterpreted as circumstances evolved. As environments shifted, populations changed, and new challenges emerged, the system could adapt its explanations while preserving its core principles. This adaptability was possible because the system focused on relationships, patterns, and processes rather than on rigid definitions or immutable structures. When observations no longer fit older interpretations, new relationships could be described without dismantling the entire framework. Rather than accumulating isolated facts, classical Chinese medicine refined ways of observing how living systems behave across time, context, and variation. This made the system resilient, not because it claimed certainty, but because it allowed uncertainty to be explored without collapse. Importantly, this endurance did not depend on uniform agreement or standardized doctrine, but on shared methods of observation and reasoning. Different lineages and traditions could emphasize different models or interpretations while still operating within the same conceptual language. Because of this, the system remained usable across regions, generations, and historical periods, even as details shifted and perspectives diversified. The continuity of classical Chinese medicine reflects not the preservation of static knowledge, but the preservation of a way of thinking about living systems. It is this underlying logic, rather than any single theory or technique, that allowed the system to remain relevant across time. As classical Chinese medicine matured, sustained observation gradually gave rise to organized ways of describing recurring patterns within the body. These descriptions did not appear all at once, nor were they imposed as abstract theories disconnected from experience. Instead, they emerged slowly as practitioners noticed consistent relationships between processes, rhythms, and responses across many individuals and situations. When similar patterns appeared repeatedly, they were given names, not to fix them permanently, but to make communication and understanding easier. These names functioned as reference points, allowing practitioners to discuss tendencies, compare observations, and refine their understanding over time. Importantly, naming a pattern did not mean it was treated as a rigid category or a universal rule. Patterns were understood to remain fluid, responsive to context, and subject to change as conditions evolved. Theory, in this sense, did not replace observation, but grew out of it and remained grounded in it. Conceptual frameworks were valued only insofar as they clarified what was happening in the body and supported appropriate response. When a theoretical description no longer aligned with lived observation, it could be revised, reinterpreted, or set aside. This relationship between observation and theory ensured that abstraction never drifted too far from experience. It also allowed knowledge to accumulate without becoming rigid, preserving the system's flexibility and responsiveness. By moving gradually from observation to theory, classical Chinese medicine maintained a balance between structure and adaptability. This balance made it possible to organize knowledge while remaining attentive to the individuality and variability of living bodies. Among the earliest and most influential frameworks to emerge from observation in classical Chinese medicine was the model known as Yin and Yang. Yin and Yang were not conceived as substances, forces, or fixed entities, but as relational principles used to describe how processes interact, oppose, and depend upon one another. Rather than naming specific things, this model described patterns of relationship, such as activity and rest, warming and cooling, expansion and contraction, or interior and exterior. These relationships were never understood as absolute or static, but as relative and constantly shifting depending on context and circumstance. What appeared as yin in one situation could function as yang in another, not because the quality itself had changed, but because its relationship within the system had shifted. This relativity allowed the yin-yang model to remain flexible, avoiding rigid classification while still providing a clear way to describe dynamic balance. Importantly, Yin and Yang were always understood as mutually dependent, meaning neither could exist or be defined without the other. Increase in one necessarily implied decrease in the other, and imbalance was understood as a disruption in this dynamic relationship rather than the presence of a single isolated fault. Because of this, the yin-yang framework was used to assess direction and tendency rather than to assign fixed labels or diagnoses. Practitioners observed whether a process was becoming relatively more active or more depleted, more outward or more inward, more warming or more cooling. This allowed imbalance to be described in terms of movement and proportion rather than as a static condition. By framing function in relational terms, Yin and Yang provided a simple yet powerful way to understand complex interactions without reducing them to rigid categories. This model became foundational not because it explained everything, but because it could be applied broadly while remaining sensitive to context and change. With these foundational ideas in place, it becomes possible to see how classical Chinese medicine formed a coherent system rather than a collection of isolated concepts. Observation, process, relationship, pattern, function, timing, and multiple perspectives were never meant to stand alone, but to work together as different ways of describing the same living reality. Each principle refined the others, allowing understanding to remain flexible while still grounded in consistent methods of reasoning. Rather than asking a single question about what the body is, classical Chinese medicine asked many related questions about how the body behaves, how it changes, and how balance is maintained over time. This approach made it possible to respond to complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it, and to describe variation without losing coherence. The frameworks introduced so far were not designed to replace direct observation, but to support it by providing language, structure, and orientation. When used correctly, theory remained secondary to experience, always returning understanding back to what could be observed in real bodies and real situations. This balance between structure and responsiveness is what allowed classical Chinese medicine to function as both a practical system and a reflective discipline. With this foundation established, later models could be introduced without confusion because they rested on the same underlying logic rather than introducing a new way of thinking. Concepts such as 5 phases, qi, and the organ systems were not separate inventions, but extensions of the principles already discussed. Understanding them requires no leap of belief, only a continued application of the same attention to relationship, process, and change. At this point, the listener is prepared to move from foundational logic into more specific theoretical models, without losing orientation or coherence. What follows will build on this foundation, not by adding complexity for its own sake, but by refining how these principles are expressed and applied.